Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
A little louder.
Can you hear me now?
Not catching your voice.
Is it catching now? You can hear?
Better.
I have to virtually eat the microphone before. Maybe this one's better.
No, it's okay. Don't. We can hear it.
You can hear now?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, oh, okay, that's good. Okay. Thank you, Forrest, for that introduction. I thought this was a graduate conference for PhD students, and I see before me this glittering array of clerics, of professors, of teachers, and I feel a little bit intimidated. The way that I feel at breakfast when I'm trying to eat and the waiters are there ready to pounce on the plates to take them away. So be gentle, please.
Just remember, we're the ones who forgot all that we once knew.
Anyway, the title is, I think, Reading Nursi Critically, a guide for graduate students. And I'm guessing that PhD students the world over are familiar with that dark and daunting phrase, "Where is the critical thinking in your work?" Or, "This chapter needs much more critical analysis." Critical analysis and critical thinking are terms which PhD supervisors and academics use time and time again when explaining what it is that they expect from their students' work. But what is critical analysis? What does it actually mean to think critically? Well, before we look at what it means, let's consider what it doesn't mean. And what it doesn't mean is criticism. If ever I have to explain to students what critical thinking is, 9 times out of 10, it's because they are confusing it with criticism. To think critically does not mean to criticize, although clearly it does not preclude criticism. So critical analysis, critical thinking, what do they actually mean? Defining the terms is not as easy as you would think. And explaining them to people who may have undergone educational and pedagogical experiences in which, for whatever reason, the skill of critical thinking has either been glossed over or ignored, is even more difficult. Out of the 40 plus students that I've had the pleasure to supervise at PhD and at master's level in the past 2 decades, my guess is that maybe 80% of them come with first degrees gained in the Middle East and or Muslim majority countries. And while it would be tempting to say that the provenance of these students is key in determining their understanding of the term critical thinking, it would be simplistic and it would be reductive. Producing work that is devoid of critical thinking is not unique to these students, and it's not peculiar to students with any particular geographical background. Having said that, when I compare, for example, UK or Western European students with those from the Middle East and further afield, I can't avoid the conclusion that, in my experience at least, there is something which sets the former apart from the latter, at least insofar as the understanding and application of critical analysis is concerned. Furthermore, and I know I risk being lynched for suggesting this, and I hope there are no water cannons or pepper gas sprays around, it would seem to hold true for the most part that it is those students with the more traditional educational backgrounds who find the notion of critical thinking the most problematic. I'll return to that later. Critical thinking is a vital component of any academic endeavor, because it is chiefly through critical thinking that new knowledge is produced and added to a particular field or discipline. Academics may agree with the conclusions of a particular article that they've read, or a particular book, a dissertation, a monograph. They may agree with the conclusions, but these conclusions present other questions which need to be addressed. Only through constantly asking, what if? How could? What does this mean for X, Y, or Z? Only with these questions is new knowledge added to the field, allowing for the continuous development and evolution of academic disciplines. That is how they evolve. Without critical thinking, the pool of knowledge would remain stagnant. We would have replication rather than application. Nothing would move forward. Nothing would move at all. So critical thinking is how disciplines evolve. According to Scriven and Paul, who give us a textbook definition of critical thinking, I quote, "Critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication, as a guide to belief and action. In its exemplary form, it is based on universal intellectual values that transcend subject matter divisions, such as clarity, accuracy, precision, consistency, relevance, sound evidence, good reasons, depth, breadth, and fairness." This is still a quote. It entails the examination of those structures or elements of thought implicit in all reasoning, purpose, problem, or question. Assumptions, concepts, empirical grounding, reasoning leading to conclusions, implications and consequences, objections from alternative viewpoints, and frame of reference. Critical thinking, in being responsive to variable subject matter, issues and purposes, is incorporated in a family of interwoven modes of thinking, among them scientific thinking, mathematical thinking, historical thinking, anthropological thinking, economic thinking, moral thinking, and philosophical thinking. So much for the textbook definition, or at least one textbook definition of critical thinking. As such, I think it is a valuable definition with much to recommend it, but I don't want to use it as the basis for my talk as it stands. Let us simplify this a little. And if you remember what Farid said yesterday, if you explain something in a way that a 6-year-old cannot understand, it means you haven't understood it yourself. So let's crystallize these textbook desiderata into a number of easy, user-friendly questions that one would be duty-bound to ask of one's source material if one were to qualify as someone who thinks critically. So let's imagine, and for some of you here you don't need to imagine, because you're already engaged in this, let's imagine that you're writing an article, or a dissertation, or a PhD, on some aspect of Nursi's teachings. The following are the kind of things that we have to ask of our subject, of Sayyid Nursi, of his books, of his secondary source critics, when we are subjecting him and his work to critical scrutiny. And as I said, these questions apply equally to secondary source authors, i.e. those academics who are writing books or monographs or papers about Nursi and his teachings. First questions. What is the author's approach or perspective? Is there another theoretical or philosophical approach which might have been taken? These are two questions, our first two questions. These questions are considered when we are trying to locate a writer or a thinker within a particular intellectual tradition, or locate him or her in a matrix of similar thinkers. And if our subject is Sayyid Nursi, we may wish to locate him, for example, within a particular theological position. What springs to mind immediately, of course, is a question that I had to ask when I was looking at Nursi's position on free will. This is just one example from memory. Is he an Asharite or a Mutazilite? These are two major groups of theological thinkers in medieval Muslim theology. My impression before I actually started writing my most recent book was that theologically Nursi is an Asharite. I'd read somewhere, or possibly I'd heard someone say, that he was an Asharite, and because I trusted what I read, I was satisfied that this was the case. And of course it wasn't. Once subjected to critical scrutiny, Nursi's theology, like Nursi himself, is very hard to pin down. He is resistant to compartmentalization. It's very difficult to put Nursi in any kind of box. On some issues he appears to side with the Asharites, on others he appears to side with the Mutazilites, and not forgetting that these are not the only theological schools within Islam, sometimes he sides with the Maturidites. And of course the conclusion for me was that theologically it's very difficult to pin him down and to put him in any particular box. I reached a similar conclusion while I was researching Nursi's approach to the philosophical concepts of the unity of existence, wahdatul wujud, and the unity of witnessing, wahdatul shuhud. And for many years I'd laboured under the illusion that Nursi favoured the latter over the former, that he favoured shuhud over wujud. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that he actually sees them as approaches which more or less signify the same thing. They are two different ways of saying the same thing. Without critical scrutiny of the whole of Nursi's output, this realization might never have occurred. And when I say here the whole of Nursi's output, I should stress that any serious student of the Risale-i Nur has to read all of the work. It's vital. It's often said that the Risale-i Nur is a mirror which is held up to the Quran. And from this perspective I would agree, because just as some of the verses of the Quran interpret other verses of the Quran, there are some parts of the Risale-i Nur which throw light on other parts. Unless we cover the whole of his work and learn to cross-reference, this ability of the Risale-i Nur to interpret itself is lost. Let's return to the questions which we need to ask in order to facilitate the critical reading of the Risale-i Nur, of Nursi's work, or of the works of any of his critics. Another question that we need to ask is, what is left out of the text and why? What is left out of the text? Does the author write from the perspective of an insider or an outsider? Now, the issue of insider-outsider involvement is doubly important, of course, when we are studying the secondary sources on Nursi, some of which are written by Nursi's disciples and those who identify themselves as admirers of his message. If the work has been produced by one of his followers, how does this affect what goes into the text, and how does it affect what is left out of the text? Another question. Are the points made by the author supported by evidence? This is another problem in PhD supervision. Where is your evidence? When Nursi substantiates his argument with evidence, is it evidence grounded in reason, or is it evidence presented by appeal to scripture? Or to use the technical terms in Arabic, is it aqli, is it rational, or is it naqli, scriptural? Or is it a mix of both? This, of course, leads to the $64,000 question. And I just wanted to stop here and ask our wonderful American friends, where does this phrase come from, $64,000 question?
Television quiz show.
Right. Another phrase that we use without questioning, I think. We need to think critically when we adopt these phrases from you guys. This leads to the $64,000 question, although with inflation it's much more these days, I would imagine. Does the author use valid reasoning? Are the arguments that he uses, or she uses, sound, or are they fallacious? Hopefully You people have no need for me to tell you that in logic, sound, true, and valid are not synonymous. The premises and conclusion can be true or false. The chain of reasoning itself can be valid or invalid. The argument as a whole is either sound or unsound. The chain of reasoning may be valid, but the argument as a whole may be unsound, and so on. We have to question these things. We have to question our sources. Another question. When making a point or presenting a statement, is the substantiating evidence anecdotal, or is it the result of research? Is the evidence referenced? Time and time again, I read papers with no references, or few references, too few references. This is another criticism which you find academics making the whole time. Often you can read through a whole page of narrative which purports to be giving us supporting evidence, but there are no references there. Now, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, or someone who's won the Nobel Prize, may have the luxury of producing outstanding pieces of work with no references. But that is a luxury which we as ordinary academics must deny ourselves. Another question that we should ask when we are critically thinking about a piece of work: is the evidence recent? In and of itself, of course, recentness is not a cast iron indicator of soundness. However, if there is work which has been done which is of major academic significance, of major intellectual significance, it would be foolhardy to overlook it. And so we need to be aware of the recentness or the antiquity of references, both in the works that we read and in the works that we produce. Does the writer present opinion as fact? This is a difficult one. Manchester United is the best football club in the world.
No.
Is clearly an opinion rather than a fact. Actually, the fact of the matter is that Chelsea is the best football club in the world. we can leave that argument for another time. Another question. Have the assumptions made by the writer been made clear to the reader? In other words, do we know where the writer is coming from? Another question. Is the author consistent within his own frame or frames of reference? Here, of course, we're concerned with contradiction. Does the author say one thing in one place but something else which is slightly different, or even totally different, in another place? How much of this is down to sloppy scholarship? And how much is attributable to the natural development of ideas over time? Sometimes we're very quick to say, well, this author in chapter 6 is or in this book is contradicting what he said in another book. Maybe his ideas changed, maybe her ideas changed. Or is it indeed sloppy scholarship? These are things that we have to make decisions on. Does the writer oversimplify complex ideas? Or does he overcomplicate simple ideas? As far as Nursi is concerned, I personally think that on the issue of free will, for example, he does both. But then simplicity and complexity are in the mind of the beholder. He may on occasion have very good reasons for oversimplifying complex ideas. After all, various treatises which comprise the Risale are aimed at different audiences, and there are times when linguistic condescension is necessary. Oversimplification, of course, usually means that something gets left out. It's impossible to simplify the issue of free will without harming the integrity of the argument to some extent. However, when Nursi simplifies a complex concept, it provides the reader still with at least an authentic taste of the full meal, so to speak. Does the writer make unsupported generalizations? This is another favorite of academics, and it's spotted usually on the feedback forms that we give to undergraduates when they give in their assignments, their term papers, as I think you call them in the States. Is that right? Having marked in excess of 400 papers this year, I can attest to this. This essay is good on the whole, but there is also a number of generalizations, unsubstantiated assertions, and instances of oversimplification. These are ingrained on my brain because I write them time and time again. Actually, the one thing I would like to write on a paper is something that I saw on the internet that a professor had written on a term paper. He wrote, "This essay has parts which are good and parts which are original. Unfortunately, the good parts are not original, and the original parts are not good." I would dearly love to write that. Another question. Does the writer make reasonable inferences? Does he or she represent the ideas of others accurately? Does he or she represent them fairly? Does the writer use unfair tactics of persuasion, such as appeal to prejudice or appeal to fear? Does the writer distort the ideas of others or present them out of context? For example, Nursi is known for his criticisms of a number of medieval scholars, and I'm thinking now off the top of my head of Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn al-Arabi. Are the issues on which he upbraids them presented out of context? Does he present these figures in a way which gives us only a partial picture of them? These are all things that we need to consider. Another question: how do we characterize the writer's tone? Does the tone of what we are reading affect our response to the text? If we're thinking about Nursi here, tone is very important. Tone can speak volumes about personal situation, about historical context, about possible states of mind, and the possible audience. Our response to a seemingly harsh tone may be equally harsh and unforgiving, and only by analyzing the work critically can we escape reckless judgments about the state of the author's mind at the time of writing or about his intention. Does the writer's language, tone, or choice of examples reveal any biases? Thinking here particularly of secondary source material. If so, do the writer's biases reduce his or her credibility? Do our reactions to the author reveal our own biases? If so, how do we ensure that we do not reproduce these biases in our writing? Does the text challenge our own beliefs, values, and assumptions? And if so, how do we deal with our author fairly? These are some of the questions that we have to consider when we think critically about an author and about the author's writings. So many questions, and this is not an exhaustive list. But when students are being asked to think critically, it is because 9 times out of 10, they've produced a narrative which lacks questions. It questions neither the subject of the study nor the sources used. The writer accepts without question what he or she has discovered in the sources. Now, acceptance is okay, as long as it's not unquestioned acceptance. If, for example, after questioning our sources, we happen to accept the arguments there, we accept the ideas and we accept the conclusions, then that acceptance is a valid one. Valid, albeit within the person's own frame of reference. You've all heard the old saying, an unexamined life is not worth living. Well, an unquestioned subject is not worth studying. Without the necessary ingredient of critical thought and analysis, anything we produce is really not worth the paper it's written on. A PhD needs to be an original piece of work that contributes to the development of the field in which it is based. Unless the seeds of our scholarship are watered by the springs of critical thinking and critical analysis, what emerges will be dry, dull, and unproductive. If we want to list what critical thinking is, we could say that it is analyzing and classifying, it's identifying assumptions, making comparisons, it is problematizing, it is solving those problems, it is questioning and challenging ideas, it is considering the facts and judging them alongside various theories and hypotheses, it is judging the validity of the source and the value of the evidence, it's making connections between ideas, theories, texts, frameworks and disciplines. It is drawing inferences and producing conclusions. It is analyzing, evaluating, it's weighing up. When these processes are missing, what are we left with? We are left with, and I've seen this so many times, a narrative that does not transcend the descriptive. It's just description. At best, it's a summary of someone else's text, supported, if at all, by a rehash of theories learned in class. Or worse still, a series of unsupported opinions, shot through with unsubstantiated assertions, generalizations, and instances of oversimplification. To repeat the phrase which I write time and time again on undergraduate essays. Now, let me go back now to this issue of inability or at times unwillingness to engage critically with authors and their texts. I'm pulling no punches here, as they say. Most of the problems that I've encountered in the supervisor-supervisee relationship and context come from people of faith who basically feel that they have to write a work of advocacy. Now, works of advocacy are all well and good, but as I tell them, save your work of advocacy until you've written your PhD, until after. A doctoral dissertation is not a work intended to promote your faith or to score points over your adversaries. The inability or the unwillingness to think critically has many reasons, of course, not least the deficiencies which inhere in educational systems where, at the lower levels especially, rote learning predominates, memorizing predominates, or where inordinate esteem is accorded to the teacher, to the class, who is a figure of authority and of course must be respected and never questioned. To enumerate the reasons behind the difficulties that some students have with critical thinking would of course take too long, but it is worth dwelling, I think, on one particular issue. It's one that some will find quite trivial, but it is one nonetheless which I think is worthy of significance. One of the reasons why people who are writing from faith perspectives, and not just religious faith perspectives, one of the reasons why people who write from faith perspectives are reluctant to engage critically, in all senses of the word, with their subjects may be the reverence and the respect which they feel ought to be accorded to their subject at all times. One student who shall remain nameless, and they're not here today, as many years ago, was writing a dissertation with me, for me, on Nursi, and today he recalls how difficult it was at the time for him to refer to the author of the Risale-i Nur as anything other than Bediüzzaman Sayyid Nursi, or even more respectfully, Bediüzzaman Hazratleri, or Ustad, which means teacher or master. To refer to Sayyid Nursi simply as Nursi seemed to him to be a step too far. It seemed disrespectful. It seemed, in a sense, antithetical to the adab or etiquette that goes with names and naming. But to refer to the author, as I used to tell him, as simply Nursi is not inherently disrespectful. It's not suspect Islamically, There's nothing in the scriptural sources to suggest that if we call someone by their surname, it is a slight on them in any way, or that it's somehow lacking in social etiquette or tact. And of course, using Nursi instead of Bediüzzaman side Nursi saves on your word count. It cuts down the word count. More importantly, as I used to tell him, it allows for that extra measure of emotional distance from the subject, and so contributes to the objectivity of the study. We need to decide which conventions are cultural rather than scriptural constructs, and if they are detrimental to our quest for a certain amount of emotional distance, we have to discard them. Incidentally, my ex-student recently told me that he is now able to refer to the author of the Risale simply as Nursi without whispering, "May God forgive me," under his breath. This may seem like a trivial point, but I think we have to take it seriously. If a student is so in awe of the person whose works he is studying that he or she cannot bring themselves to refer to that person by the surname only, what likelihood is there that he will be able to subject that person's work to critical scrutiny? If you can't call an author by their surname because you think it's rude, how on earth are you going to be able to think critically about their work? Which brings me to my final section, and that is criticism, or criticizing scholars. As I said at the outset, critical analysis is not synonymous with criticism, although obviously it does not preclude criticism. I know that some students find criticism of a major scholar somewhat difficult, and this difficulty, of course, is compounded considerably when the scholar in question is a person of great piety and spirituality and is revered for other reasons. Well, all human beings, of course, are worthy of respect, regardless of whether we happen to think they are right or wrong on a particular issue. To criticize a scholar of repute, someone who naturally commands great respect, as long as this criticism is constructive, as long as it is delivered judiciously and in the sincere spirit of inquiry, this really should not cause us any sleepless nights. It's not a question of finding fault, although finding fault is nothing that we should shy away from, as long as we do not make it our mission to find fault. Besides, great scholars of piety and spirituality have very thick skins. And the Quran itself finds fault with the prophets. And if prophets can make mistakes, of course so can scholars. On this particular score, no one is immune and no one is infallible. Nursi himself had absolutely no problem criticizing fellow scholars. As I said, Ibn Sina, Farabi and Ibn Arabi are three notable examples. In fact, the spirit of inquiry among medieval theologians was such that critique and counter-critique was considered part and parcel of the scholastic theological endeavor. Ghazali's famous Tahafut al-Falasifa, rejection of the philosophers, and Ibn Rushd's answer to that, Tahafut al-Tahafut, are two examples of the critique and counter-critique, which itself arguably constitutes a whole genre of medieval Islamic literature. So, it is axiomatic, then, that critical analysis is key to good scholarship, and it's something that students ignore or misapprehend at their peril. Those budding scholars who self-identify as Muslims have no excuses, because they have a very noble role model in their midst in the form of the Quran itself, which not only exhorts its followers to think, tafakkur, deliberate, tadabbur, and exercise their powers of reason, ta'aqqul, but it also challenges them to look at God's creation with a critical eye, and, if they are able, to discover any faults or deficiencies. If this is not a call for critical analysis on all levels of life, then I don't know what is. Thank you very much. Do I choose who questions me or does someone else?
No, you will do that.
Does. Yes. This is one of my PhD students, and none of this applies to him. He is perfectly adept at thinking critically.
He kept on saying him, so it doesn't apply to Badu as well.
I have yet to get into the habit of referring to she all the way through, and I was talking about Nursi and I found it uncomfortable. So,
thanks so much for the presentation. I enjoyed it much. Although we have discussed a lot with those issues, but I mean, when you talk about advocacy of faith-based students having accepted the fact, there is, your observation will be, there is an element of advocacy in the faith-based students, or the most so-called, how do you call it, Nursi students, students are, but the problem is that maybe, I accept this point, but my point or observation is, I think we have alienated from our past. I would like to mention 3 genres of literature, which is more relevant to the critical writing or critical thinking in medieval Islamic literature. Even Nursi also often mentions, often refers, even write a book on it, on the line like shaykh, which is commentary on the book, like Shaykh al-Bukhari, Shaykh al-Hidayah, a lot of books written on this genre, which is, completely is a critical writing. And the second one is tariqat, which is also, tariqat is something written, critically written on the shaykh of the book, on the commentary of the book.
So we have a commentary and then we have a commentary on the commentary.
Yeah. Then
we have another
commentary which is Hashia, which is also critical thinking, which is very interesting. But I think we have elements from our past. That's why, this is something that we have to accept. That's our weakness. We have to think carefully, and we have to go back.
Do you think it's a problem of modern educational systems in certain places?
I think might be, but there's my observation that recently we had an experience actually together. We are in Germany. Actually, we are sitting with troops, and Colin also was here, and we are sitting having a breakfast, and Colin doesn't have water. He wants to drink a tea, and he stand up and go himself and wants to take a tea. And I said, I was sitting there, and one of the big RBs, he offered me, please serve your teacher, okay? And I stand up and I tried to grab the teapot and would like to serve the Colin, and he said he didn't allow me to do this. And I was embarrassed because it's rude for us, among our big RBs, not to serve for our elders. And that is something we have to be careful, because always you said, you advise us, please follow the academic convention of the Western thought, or academic convention in the universities. And then I said to you, please follow the please follow the RB's convention while we are sitting in our circle. So that's kind of, from my understanding, so maybe we should be thinking our alienated past scholarships, like, okay, we are different from the Western people, and I was born in the East, and my mind, like kind of Eastern, although I tried to adapt myself in a Western convention, Western academic convention these days. Maybe we have to create another perspective. Why the people in the East should follow all the conventions of the East and of the West?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's not all the conventions, but you have to think of the practicalities of the situation as it stands. You can, sort of future-proof it and plan for the future, but in the current atmosphere in Western academy, relativity and objectivity are the default settings of scholarship. And somehow we have to navigate those.
I mean, as a conclusion, I do accept your all arguments, having said that, I mean, personally, I do have problems, those kind of stuff, and we have to focus on our past as well, how they have arrived critically, because Islamic scholarship is full of critical thinking and critical writing. Thank you for your presentation.
Yes.
Thank you, and I think your speech should be given to all PhD students regardless of the field that they're in, the principles you laid out. So this is another $64,000 question. Would you, as an Islamic scholar, or are there Islamic scholars that are subjecting the Quran itself to the kind of critical thinking that you're advocating for Nursi's work? And if not, why not? Or if so, could you tell us more about that?
I think there are scholars modern scholars who are subjecting the Quran to hermeneutical scrutiny, trying to understand and trying to produce commentaries on the meanings of the Quran. And there are some who do engage with the Quran critically. I think they're thin on the ground because contemporary Quranic commentary is not that rich or vibrant a field. But there are people who are working, for example, on the anthropology of the Quran and who are looking at the Quran from various different social scientific perspectives. But clearly we don't have the vibrancy and the dynamism that exists, I think, in the Christian tradition or in the Western tradition of Bible analysis. Farid.
Getting back to the earlier discussion on getting back our tradition and being rooted in Islamic tradition as opposed to Western tradition, I'd like to say that I don't think it's a question of Islamic or Western or Eastern or Western. Yeah. I think we have to be very careful to avoid falling into that way of thinking in terms of dichotomies. When it's a matter of faith, of aqidah, of iman, you can say that you want to be rooted in your tradition. But when we're talking about intellectual pursuits, it's a dangerous approach to adopt. The Islamic tradition itself, as far as intellectual pursuits are concerned, that tradition itself is heir to other earlier traditions. For example, the whole field of logic cannot be imagined without the Greek contribution. And in relation to what Colin was discussing on critique, one of the in traditional medieval European scholarship as well as pre-modern Islamic scholarship, they taught one of the methods of argumentation, safsata, sophistics, which was not something that they taught students to apply, but to avoid. That's an example of critical thinking when you expose the sophistry in people's scholarship. But these ideas, many of the ideas concerning sophistry, comes from the the Greeks, right? But the Muslims never took the view that, well, that's not our tradition. Because they understood that the different methods of argumentation, whether it is dialectics or demonstration, rhetoric and so on, these are simply, they simply have to do with the way the mind works, whether you're a Muslim or a non-Muslim. So in this sense, we will not make a distinction between an Islamic tradition and a non-Islamic tradition. We just simply use what is good and useful. Now, if we were to continue with, to learn logic, we should go to the Islamic tradition, but we cannot ignore what Western scholarship has added to the discipline of logic. This argument also applies to concepts. We must understand the Islamic tradition as far as concepts are concerned, but we cannot ignore the Western contribution as far as concepts are concerned. For example, the concept of ideology is indispensable in anthropological, sociological studies, psychology, history, philosophy. The concept of ideology does not exist in Islamic tradition. It is a Western contribution, and it is an indispensable concept. Today, in the for modern Muslims, if we want to think about aqidah, we may find the Western concept of worldview or Weltanschauung useful to elaborate what we mean by aqidah in ways that perhaps were not elaborated by the traditional scholars. So, don't think in terms of East and West. Think in terms of what is best to arrive at a certain goal.
Yeah. Farid, thank you for that. I think that is an important point. It's also one of the reasons why I tell my students when they write things in their papers such as Islamic theology or Islamic law, that there is no such thing as Islamic theology, there is no such thing as Islamic law, there is no such thing as the Muslim world, there is no such thing as an Islamic city. Because when you use Islamic, first of all, you naturally then are presupposing that it has a Quranic sanction and that you actually are essentializing. Theology in the Muslim context is not just one theology, it is theologies. Muslim philosophy is not just one philosophy, it is philosophies. These are the results of cross-pollination of ideas from different traditions, from Christianity, from Judaism. These are hybrids. And so, at best, we can call them Muslim theology, Muslim philosophy. Sorry.
Thank you very much for this great presentation, for a grounding work for everyone actually, for everyone who is indulging with the knowledge. Just actually, I want to kind of remember that for any student who is dealing with theology and philosophy, it's sometimes difficult to kind of touch with the great names like Hüccetül Islam, the great indecisive proof of Islam, Ghazali, Hüccetül Islam, Ghazali, and the great Sheikh, great Guru, Ibn Sina, great Judge, Ibn Rushd, and Muallim Sani, the greatest scholar, Farabi, and Saint Thomas Aquinas, Saint Anselm, and those all great names and great actually untouchable names are making quite difficult for the students to get in touch with those names and their ideas. I think the teachings of early Islamic knowledge started with two subjects, mantık and mantık. Mantık is the logic which tries to save the mind from fallacy, as Fred was saying. Actually, it's quite important to give the frame of sound thinking, valid thinking, and the other one is mantık, which is giving the frame of validity of language, how to use the kind of corrective way of language. I think this is still ongoing problem in modern academia, how to use mantık and mantuk, the mind and language, how to be utilized in oriented knowledge. It's called actually audiobook bahs ve münazara within the logical sciences, which means critical thinking and argumentation. Audiobook bahs ve münazara. And there are many books about how to utilize logical tools for argumentation. Actually, that's, I believe, it's really meant critical thinking in the past. And these all Reddies, Risale, contrary Risales, always derived from the ethic of the knowledge. And we are now in Istanbul, actually it's one of the earliest universal university, Sahne Saman medreses, Fatih Sultan Mehmet, who established those medreses. And one of the unique thing about these medreses was offering the scholars to come together, for example, tahafut tradition, to come together and discuss daily matters in discursive matter. Actually, in tahafut tradition, tahafut means incoherence. So when someone argues for something, someone who is refuting his ideas on the basis of tahafut, you are wrong on those points, you are wrong in that way of applying your methodology in so on and so forth way. So I think tahafut tradition has stopped by Ismail Geleblevi, 1789. He is counted one of the latest chain of the classical Islamic thought and logic actually. This guy actually is from my hometown, Ismail Geleblevi. He had died by the heart attack. The reason why he had a heart attack, he wrote a small Risale, and he wrote actually about Ru'yat al-Hilal. And Muslim has to apply Ru'yat al-Hilal by calculation of the lunar eclipse and all calculations.
The sighting of the moon.
The moon. Actually, Shaykh Islam at the time, instead of writing a refutation of his ideas by the claim of the time, actually he spread the gossip. Actually, how bad this Ismail Geleblevi is, how his social life is not nice, and he attacked to him, and he made the fellowship at bachelor. He kind of put a bad name over him instead of criticizing his ideas and his knowledge. And Ismail Geleblevi couldn't resist that gossips around him instead of writing a paper against his ideas, and he had a heart attack. And this same Ismail Geleblevi is the scholar Seyh Nursi wrote about tarikat. Tarikat is about Geleblevi's logical treatise critique, actually. So Seyh Nursi is coming actually from the Boz tradition, from one way. He's coming from straight from traditional Islamic thought and logic tradition. The way he used the critical words in Risale-i Nur are always coming from the medrese tradition, from the logical vocabulary. Tasdika, and all sort of language, vocabulary comes from those tradition. But what he's doing that, he's using the traditional discourse to renew of the thought of his time. So in his books, for example, Münazarat and Muhakema, actually, for me, both of them are very critical thinking examples of thought. Münazarat and Muhakema are criticizing the whole history of Islamic thought in one way. He's coming from the tradition, but he's very delicately criticizing the ideas of the past. And I think in the Munazarat, one of the last words in his Munazarat, he was saying, don't take my words without putting them in critical way of thinking, without putting them in a delicate balancing way. So don't take my words. He's finishing his book by saying that. So think about it. If you think it's a reasonable, rational, take it. If you don't believe it's a right, correct, and it's not acceptable, don't take it. Seyh Nursi says this himself in his book. And I think from this point of view, in the history of Islamic thought, there was always discourse, counter-discourse, kind of mutual discussion. I think we are about to lose this in the Islamic studies.
Why do you think that we've lost it? Or why do you think that Muslims have lost, generally speaking, have lost the willingness or ability to carry on this tradition of critique and counter-critique and counter-critique.
Yes, I think we have to find out. I think.
But can anyone suggest why we? Yes.
One suggestion for why people would step away from a process that remains open is fear. If I feel too vulnerable, I don't want to have my position undermined, taken out from under my feet.
And that prevents us from engaging critically with our source subject.
I won't repeat all of the praise that is due to helping students to think and write critically. I think that's a wonderful contribution, particularly to this conference. I want to make a theological statement, and it will be controversial. In order to understand the difference between Western development of critical thinking, not simply in the Enlightenment and after the Enlightenment, but also within the history of Christianity in the patristic period and the medieval period, I think we need to take very seriously the Christian doctrine of the Logos. Logos, the Greek term, can be translated as reason, as word, as thinking, and so forth. But in the New Testament, particularly, for example, in the Gospel of John, God has created the world through the Logos. This is a statement that is repeated in diverse kinds of literature in the New Testament. And in John's Gospel, the statement is, the Logos was the light of all human beings who came into the world. Now, this implies theologically that human reason, human openness to reality, is something which is God-given, which is already a kind of participation in the reality of God, the Creator. This is perhaps not the same thing as Nursi's idea that we are the beautiful names of God written small, microcosmically, and reflecting as a kind of a mirror the richness of God, of Allah. But this is a participation which invites the using of our reason for understanding God Himself. And this was reflected right at the beginning of Christian theology, for example, in the apologists. Those early writers who engaged Greek philosophy, saying the best of Greek philosophy was learned from the Christian revelation. And that's an outrageous and unsupportable claim. But it indicates that they thought that reason was not alien to revelation. And then we come to Anselm, St. Augustine and St. Anselm's idea of faith. Theology is faith seeking understanding. That faith loves its object, and just like a lover seeks to see the beloved, so a true faith, a lively faith, not a dead faith, but a lively faith, will seek ever deeper understanding, knowing that comprehension is impossible, but wants to see more and more of what he or she believes. Then, as Colin very, very nicely pointed out, the very structure of scholastic theological debate was debate structure. The hypothesis would be thrown out, would be then critically pro and con, and then a resolution would be offered, and in response to the criticisms, it was an appeal to reason. And then when we have the 14th century, the nominalist critique of scholastic realism in philosophy, from Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. We have a massive critique from within theology of the whole damn theological tradition before it. And then, of course, the whole thing becomes secularized with the Enlightenment, and then the great figures of Immanuel Kant, and then the great critique of religion with Feuerbach, Nietzsche, Freud, and so forth. And then the critique of modernism from postmodernist writers. So this is a deep, deep tradition in the West of critical reflection, and my suggestion, and it's really, this is Christian, this is Muslim Christian debate in a, not simply being polite, but this is a challenge. Does the difference possibly lie in the very doctrine of God between Christianity and Islam? That for Islam, the word, God cannot be differentiated as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but in Christianity it can. And there's a place for the Logos, both in God and in God's creatures. That gives reason a whole different place. Nor ein Vorschlag, only a suggestion.
Yeah, I think it's a very good suggestion, and I think that it resonates with us because we see in the Islamic revelation signs which envision the symbiosis between revelation and reason. When the Quran talks about thinking, deliberating, and actually using one's powers of reason. And we see that this symbiosis was engaged with by the medieval scholastic theologians and philosophers. And from that, of course, there is emerged a tension between reason and revelation, but also a reconciliation between reason and revelation. The fact that reason and revelation can work hand in hand, and that revelation can, in a sense, confirm what reason discovers, and reason can also confirm what revelation provides or gives to us. Why that was lost, why our ability to run with that, so to speak, was lost, again, I think it is multi-causal, multifactorial, and it really does need to be addressed. But thank you for that. That was an excellent overview of the position in the Christian tradition.
Colin, can I just echo, this was a very helpful paper, and I do think it would be good to make it widely available and to really do make sure that we share it widely on the internet. I would love a copy of it.
Thank you.
And so on. It was very helpful, I think. When I was editing Globalization, Ethics in Islam, which was one of the conferences organised by the Foundation, I looked at something like 40, 50 papers.
Yeah.
And it was hard, I mean, I'll be candid, it was hard work selecting those which were publishable. And to be honest,
please be,
what
please.
I say, but there are some essays in that volume which are still significantly weak. And the problem I found as I was working through them, reading them all, was a lack of structure, a lack of arguments. It was almost as if they wanted to share everything they knew about the Risale and globalization or whatever. And it was almost dumped out there. It was sort of a big dump.
Freudian, slip into something more Freudian.
So, and what intrigued me was, I mean, how do you teach structure? How do you teach, have a sense of where this paper's going, be selective about what you want to choose, identify 3 or 4 key points that come to an argument that establishes a thesis. How do you teach that? And then we sort of flirted around the issue of why is it And I accept entirely that historically there's a deep tradition of critical thinking in the Islamic tradition. In fact, I think in many ways it modelled it, and much of the West learned from it. But certainly over the last 50 years, there is a local problem of certain cultures. Well, no, I better stop there.
Well, no, I mean, I sort of skirted around that, and I said I wouldn't pull any punches. There is a local problem. But I can't put my finger on the exact causes. Is it the post-colonial education system? Is it the tradition of rote learning in oral cultures? Are we living with the residue of that? Is it just the fact that in certain parts, authority figures still carry a big stick, so to speak, and still carry a lot of weight and are accorded esteem and respect? When I was growing up in England, the teacher, the policeman, and the doctor, these were three authority figures. And you couldn't really question. You can't question the policeman, you don't question the doctor, and you don't question the teacher. That has fallen by the wayside, thankfully. Some people will say, overly so. But do you think that may be one of the problems because of this sort of bowing down at the altar of authority? I don't know. It's a combination of things.
Looking at the ceiling of this room gives me one answer to Ian Markham's question of how do you help a writer find form for the thoughts other than just amassing a flow of descriptive information. It helps if you decide what is central and what is supportive and what is, look at the panels on the side wall, what is informative, but it does cohere in a rectangular structure. I think when you're writing and you get lost in words, it can be very helpful if you stop and make a picture, a scheme, a diagram, a blueprint.
That's very helpful. Is there any? Sorry, I'm not looking at this side of the room. Can we? And then come back to David.
Sorry, he's helping you.
Thank you, sir. Actually, I really enjoyed your presentation as a research methodology class.
It is actually part of a research methods course. It's something I do for new PhD students.
Yeah.
Slightly amended.
My research topic is concerned, it is about critical study of madrasa education in India.
Wonderful.
Actually, I have some doubts. Now I want to clear that. I attended so many research methodology class. Someone said if we do a critical study or critical research, for example, I am doing about madrasa. So someone said you should not mention any positive things of madrasas in India. Someone said you can mention something, but someone said you should mention half of positives, half of negatives. So can you help me, sir?
Yeah, what you leave in and what you leave out as an insider, because you're an insider. You're in India. India is open enough, and if you're careful, I mean, go for it. Right from the heart and the mind, and tell it as it is. Basically, I can't really give any other advice than to do that. Engage with it critically in the way that I tried to outline here. Does anyone else have any advice? Farid?
You see, I'm very sympathetic to the questions that you and others are asking. And it relates to how we have arrived at this situation. And I think Colin had mentioned something about the nature of post-colonial education, both in the West as well as outside of the West. There is an alienation from tradition. You don't study logic in university unless you are perhaps a philosophy student. Whereas in the past, everyone would study the basics of logic. So in the universities, in the faculty of arts and social sciences, in most universities around the world, most students would not even be taught how to define things. They won't be taught the definition of definition, for example, unless you happen to be a philosophy student. Then maybe you will have such instruction. So there's that alienation from tradition. In the Muslim world, part of the problem has to do with Eurocentrism or Orientalism, where our traditions are marginalized. So that is an added problem. We can, of course, as Colin said, the problem is multi-causal. But having said that, I think we fail our students in the sense that we don't teach them the basics of thinking. For example, when Colin said, you said tell it like it is, right? Yes, as Ibn Khaldun said that the study of history should be about the haqqani al-ashya, the reality of things. Now, when we talk about the reality of things, when we talk about telling it like it is, we should be telling our students that when you are talking about anything, about any phenomenon, you are either talking about what the thing is, its definition, or its nature, its characteristics, or you are talking about where it comes from, its origins, or you are talking about the impact or the function of that thing. And it's interesting, you see, it's a very simple thing that I'm saying, right? Whatever you may have to say about anything in the world, any phenomenon, will come under one of these categories. Its definition, its origins, its causes, its function. These are some basic things which are simple to understand but are never taught to students. And so they find it very difficult to approach a research question. And of course, some of the basic things you come to find from Aristotle's logic, about the categories and the methods of logic and argumentation and so on. These are basic things that should not be confined to students of philosophy, but should be taught to everyone in the sciences, in the humanities and the sciences and the social sciences. So we have a larger problem, in other words, of the very structure of our education system. So in a sense, we are trying to do that kind of training, or we should be trying to give that kind of training at these kinds of conferences and workshops, because the universities are not doing their job.
Yeah, I think even sometimes when it is taught, it's taught as a dead art, and then when people reproduce knowledge about that, it's a descriptive knowledge, not analytical. Conflict of interests. No, it's okay. Yeah.
Just a question about constructing new concepts. I know that as a student that you're always being taught to substantiate what you say, bring in lots of references and so on, and that's not a problem, but when you come to the point that you want to give your own idea, so as a result of other ideas which you've examined, you come with a new idea and you say this is your own idea. I find that it's very difficult for supervisors or to accept this for a student. Whereas if it's someone who is an established writer and comes with a new idea, it becomes, oh, fantastic, it's new. But from a student, it's not acceptable. It always has to be substantiated. What if we have no other reference? What if we use other references to come to this new idea of our own? And should it, do we then search for endlessly, which is not something like our idea, but it's not actually our idea. And is that correct? Is that the right thing to do, really?
I think just as students have problems with their teachers, teachers have problems with their students. The first point that you're making is, why do teachers or why do supervisors, why are they reluctant to accept the innovative research of their students? Well, at the PhD level, PhDs are supposed to be works which are innovative. So that shouldn't be a problem on paper. Secondly, you were saying, why do we have to reference our own ideas if they're new ideas? Why do you have to substantiate them? Is that what you're saying?
No, I just see a contradiction there. That on the one hand, you have to be innovative. On the other hand, they're asking to substantiate.
But if you're developing a new idea or concept, then one would think it is a synthesis of ideas which you've looked at and researched. And the fact that there's nothing new under the sun, as they say. But if you're producing something which you consider to be new, then it is a result of research and reasoning and the bringing together of ideas that others have had. Putting them together and producing something new. I don't see why people would have a problem with that. It would be substantiated because the reader of that thesis, the supervisor, the teacher, would see that it is the result of a process of reasoning, of gathering, of evaluating, of weighing up different ideas and approaches and theories. So on paper, there's no problem with that. That doesn't answer your question, though.
It does, but I'm saying there's a tendency not to accept it from students because the idea is that it should always be substantiated, and there's no theory out there that fits with your idea. And then you think, well, no, there isn't, because it is my idea.
But the idea doesn't come in a vacuum. It doesn't occur in a vacuum.
You've made all those references, you've said, up to where you agree to those things and what is the influence, and go through the whole process that you've outlined, but then you come to a new concept because of those ideas.
I don't think that's
good. There's a tendency
on paper that's not problematic, but yeah, maybe in practice.
To just maybe see the picture of what we are saying, we should actually call the witnesses as a reference. These witnesses can come from the past, or these witnesses could be yourself. I think the whole idea is just to put the witnesses in the right place, what they are saying. So without any witness, there's no much chance you can really prove your point. Really.
Yeah, you're saying that to be a witness to yourself would not be enough.
As a professor for 35 years, correcting student essays, just as Colin has said, I've struggled with this whole question of student critical presentation. And I think if I had to teach one thing, it would be that a student should distinguish between his subject or her subject and her thesis. The subject is what you're writing about. It might be Nursi's ideas about the divine names, whatever. The thesis is an idea about this subject. This is a claim. This is an idea you want to tell the reader, that you want to convince the reader of the truth of an idea about this subject. This distinction between subject and thesis is fundamental, and many students have never learned it. Then in the body of the paper, the first part of the paper is where you state what your subject is and what your thesis is. Then the body of the paper is giving reasons and arguments for the truth of your idea. And then in the conclusion, which should be very brief and to the point, maybe some implications for further research and thinking based upon the validity of the idea that you have just proven or at least given sound arguments for its validity. So this is what I try to teach students, and this gives a paper a structure. It helps students to say, okay, what is my subject? And then what is the big idea that I want to make about this subject? And then what are the reasons, what are my arguments for the truth of this idea that I have about Nursi's idea of the beautiful names? And then if my idea has value, what are some of the implications for further thinking or for further behavior? So that's what I try to help students with.
Thank you. You were clearly an exemplary teacher, because I can't say anything to, add to that or better it. I think we've overrun our time. Is that right?
Yes.
Sorry. Thank you very much anyway.